we're going to have to talk a little bit about the crises that are facing Indigenous communities in Canada today. And this video is all about sort of infrastructure crises. So we could talk about a number of different things, but there are a number of things in terms of quality of life that really just accrue to the kind of built environment and amenities you have access to. So we can talk, for example, about your quality of life being higher if you live near attractive green space. We can talk about your quality of life being higher if you have access to reliable power, reliable clean water, all of that kind of thing. And overall, we should probably start with, okay, in this discussion is to understand that by and large there is less infrastructure in Indigenous communities than in other sort of non-Indigenous communities of similar size. So, I mean, it's not reasonable to expect that a small hamlet of 400 people has the same sort of services and amenities available as a city like Toronto, but what you see is that an Indigenous community of 400 people and a non-Indigenous community of 400 people have different amounts of infrastructure. So the Indigenous community will have less infrastructure available, and by and large that infrastructure will be poorer quality. This is linked to sort of what I said in our last video, that one of the sort of tendencies in the federal government is to try to spend as little as possible in Indigenous affairs and Indigenous issues. And that has been the case for a really, really, really long time. We can sort of talk about what that looks like. But the other sort of challenge in that, which is sort of more, I guess, immediately accessible to my students and to sort of people individually, is to say that one of the reasons the federal government can do that, and one of the reasons the federal government doesn't tend to spend in Indigenous affairs and Indigenous issues, is because voters don't tell them it matters, right? So there's a lot of sort of conversation around sort of the way that money is spent, and there's not a lot of voters saying to their MPs, to their MLAs, hey, I really think that the Indigenous community down the road from me should have access to clean drinking water. When people aren't saying that, politicians aren't getting the message that that's important. And so instead of seeing that spending as responding to important needs and desires for their constituents, which is sort of what elected politicians are supposed to do, they wind up seeing that money spent in Indigenous communities as, at the very best, some kind of moral obligation, and then worse than that, sort of like a distraction from the things that my electorate actually cares about. So one of the challenges in terms of infrastructure crises and funding crises across the board in Indigenous communities is actually that non-Indigenous Canadians don't show that they care about them. They don't show that it's really, really important to them that these crises be resolved. And I mention that not necessarily to make everybody depressed, but because that is a thing you can fix. If this is something that bothers you, if this is a situation that you find really untenable, you can do something about that. You can write to your MLA, you can write to your MP, and sort of tell them that this is something that you would really like to have resolved. So that said, overall, you need to understand sort of what kind of disparity we're talking about here. And probably the easiest way to talk about this, and this is not a perfect measurement, but it will work for this sort of purpose of the illustration, is to talk about the UN's Human Development Index. And this is a very complicated set of formulas that tracks things like literacy rates and life expectancy and levels of stress and employment and all kinds of like social variables that is really supposed to talk about people's quality of life in different places. Okay, for a while, and when we sort of talk about that, the specifics of it are not really important in this conversation. They are if you want to get into that sort of demographic work, but for right now, they're not super important. What you need to understand for this lecture is that Canada generally ranks really, really well. So the last time I checked the numbers, and it may have changed a little bit since then, Canada is like 9th on the list of the UN's Human Development Index, which means that it is the 9th highest in terms of expected quality of life for people. Okay, that's really good. However, methodologically, the UN Human Development Index, for a number of reasons that, again, we're not getting into right now, has split out Canada essentially into two entries. You have Indigenous Canadians living on reserve and everybody else. And everybody else ranks 9th in the world. which is pretty good. Aboriginal Canadians living on reserve rank somewhere around 63. And this has sort of been referred to as sort of like third world conditions, because if you start naming the countries that you think have the highest quality of life, you're probably getting to a lot of places that you don't really want to move to. You're not immigrating to improve your quality of life by the time you hit 63. Um, the whole idea of third world is a complicated one, and we're not going to sort of get into that. What you need to understand is that there's a pretty significant disparity between the way that non-Indigenous Canadians living anywhere in the country, essentially, experience life versus Indigenous Canadians living on reserves. Okay? There are some specific pieces of that, and we're going to do a little bit of that now. So one of the sort of very basic ones is things like access to clean drinking water. So right now, about 20% of Indigenous communities in the country right now, i.e. 20% of reserve communities, that sort of thing, are under boil water orders, which means that they can't drink, or have been told they cannot safely drink, the water that comes out of their taps, if there's water coming out of the taps at all. Okay? This is, again, linked to federal spending. So you don't really have to be a water quality engineer to understand that a water filtration system that you expect to cover 200 people for 10 years is not sufficient to cover a community of 450 people for 25. Because the parts break down, you have all kinds of other things that are going on. And if you remember when we talked about sort of Duncan Scott and the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, initially, and even into like the 1960s, most federal politicians and most politicians in general figured it was only a matter of time before Indigenous populations assimilated. And to them, assimilation meant leaving their reserve communities and moving to the city. So they never really built infrastructure that was designed to last for a really long time, because they weren't expecting to need it. And because of that sort of mental model that all we were waiting for was people to assimilate, they never intended for those communities to grow. And that's really, really important, because as far as it goes, Indigenous communities and Indigenous populations are some of the fastest growing in Canada, in that sort of non-Indigenous women have far fewer children than Indigenous women. There's a whole lot of pieces that go into that, but those communities are growing. And that's before we get into sort of the influx back into Indigenous communities after Bill C-35. So this infrastructure, in terms of things like water, was overridden beforehand, and it is sort of quite expensive to go in and fix now. And so there's sort of been a lot of foot dragging and a lot of promises. There have been a lot of communities. I was reading the other day about an Indigenous community in Ontario that has been under a boil water order for 25 years. So for 25 years, it hasn't been safe to drink the water coming out of their taps. That is when we're talking about pure water quality questions, in terms of like filtration, and sometimes we have even more sort of complicated pieces. The classic example in this discussion in terms of clean drinking water is to talk about a community, an Indigenous community in Grassy Narrows, Ontario, where their water has been contaminated with mercury from a relatively nearby industrial site for the last 40 years. And the government spent a lot of time trying to cover it up, and then we sort of there sort of became a conversation about birth defects, a conversation about learning disabilities, a conversation about all kinds of serious health consequences for people living in that community. So there's a drinking water problem in terms of infrastructure. There's also an infrastructure problem in terms of access to safe and secure housing. So part of this is connected to the idea about who owns land, right? So we talked about this a little bit, and this does become important again when we talk about the Nisga'a claim later on. But one of the challenges with working on reserve in terms of trying to maintain a home and that kind of thing is that individuals do not own homes on reserves. Those homes are owned by the Band Council and then are sort of assigned to people. So, you know, the Band Council tells you, well, you live here, okay? And that is really challenging, because it is the same kind of problem many of my students probably have if they have or live in apartments. Because if something goes wrong, you have to go, like you, because you don't own the home, can't have a plumber in to fix things. You can't decide to replace the roof because it's not your house. So if you want to replace the roof in your home, you have to go to the band council and ask the band council to sort of hire someone to replace the roof. And that kind of process, first of all, takes time, right? And so if you're saying, I would like to replace my roof because it started leaking last week and it takes the band council 2 or 3 weeks to fix the problem, now you have 3 weeks of water in your house. And that can cause some serious damage, and that sort of long-term effect is sort of problematic in a lot of these communities. Um, but there's also sort of some resource questions there, right? In that the band council doesn't necessarily have enough money to replace all of the roofs that are going out, so they have to do a kind of triage to decide, okay, well, which are the problems that we're going to fix, and how do we rate, for example, roof repairs with repairing windows and insulation? How do we sort of compare those things? And for those of you who have sort of watched your parents do it or own your own homes, that can be complicated enough when you have one house, let alone when you have an entire community of them to manage. And the other thing that I should sort of mention is that by and large, the quality of housing stock in Indigenous communities is poorer than it is in many other places, sort of similar spaces. So, for example, you will talk about homes that were not built to support the size of families that are living in them. So, for example, you'll have a home with 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom where you have 9, 10, 11 people living. And that causes a problem because it sort of does things like it means that your toilet is getting flushed way more than it is expected to do. It means that there isn't a ton of space for people to sort of have their own space, to sort of be able to be alone if that's what they want to do. You have conversations about, families sleeping in shifts so everyone can sleep in a bed because there isn't really space. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the assumptions we make about how much space is necessary for a family, right? The amount of space that you need if you're going to talk about a family of 4, i.e. 2 parents and 2 children, is quite different than the amount of space and the configuration of that space you're going to want if you're going to talk about a family of 12. And especially that becomes important if you're not talking about a family of 12 in terms of 2 adults and their 10 children, but an arrangement that sort of talks about, well, this is, my home and I live with my spouse and our 4 children, so that's 6, but my mom and his dad and my sister and, like that kind of extended family configuration calls for different arrangements of space because adults have different understandings about how much control they need, all of that sort of stuff. The other problem with a lot of housing in Indigenous communities is that because those communities are somewhat more remote, many of them are farther north than most of the cities, but that's mostly just because a lot of Canadian cities are really far south. Um, the housing itself was not designed to withstand the elements because it was designed in some central location in Ottawa. And for any of you who have been there, a house that is designed to deal with the cold that to deal with the elements as you get in Ottawa is not the same as what you need to deal with Fort Vermilion. Is not the same as what you need to deal with sort of the tundra and the wind and the cold and all of that sort of stuff. And on top of that, generally speaking, the intent is to build these homes as cheaply as possible, which means you're sort of the contractors and the government is also sort of skimping on materials and is not, for example, putting in granite countertops is sort of the example, but that's not really the relevant one. It's not necessarily about granite countertops so much as it is about ensuring that you putting in really high quality insulation and really high quality windows, and you're ensuring that all of those sorts of things are in place because these houses are going to see a lot of use. And generally speaking, the federal government has not been particularly willing to do that. And individual people living in these houses can't make those investments because they don't own them, which is sort of another challenge. The other sort of piece of an infrastructure crisis that I want you guys to think about is just access to community and amenities. So there's a lot of things outside of your physical home and things like drinking water that are really, really important to your quality of life. This includes things like after school activities for yourself, your children, that kind of thing. Rec centers in general, when we talk about swimming pools, skating rinks, that kind of thing. Access to economic development and jobs in general. And then things like access to retail services and the ability to sort of shop in your community. And a really great example of this is if you sort of have ever looked at what the price of groceries in Canada's north is. You'll sort of get a 4-liter jug of milk that costs $13, which is also sort of a question about access to community amenities and infrastructure.